I've been working as a late-night technician and broadcast engineer for a small, independent AM radio station in rural Pennsylvania for over 10 years. Our station, WKEI-IM, operates out of an old, converted brick warehouse sitting at the very end of a gravel road, surrounded by miles of empty cornfields and dense woods. During the day, the station broadcasts local news and country music, but after midnight, the entire staff goes home, leaving me entirely alone in the dark building to monitor the automated broadcast equipment and ensure the main transmitter tower doesn't overheat. It was a stormy Tuesday night in December. Right around 2:45 a.m., a violent thunderstorm was raging outside, the heavy rain hammering against the tin roof of the warehouse, while flashes of lightning illuminated the massive, empty studio rooms through the glass partitions. I was sitting in the main control room, surrounded by glowing green monitors and massive audio mixing boards, sipping a cup of black coffee to stay awake. Suddenly, the main audio monitor console in front of me began to twitch. The green decibel meters violently spiked into the red zone, filling the room with a harsh, high-pitched whine. "Hey!" I frowned, leaning forward to adjust the dials. Nucky was supposed to be broadcasting an automated loop of old-time radio dramas at this hour. I put on my heavy studio headphones to listen to the live feed, assuming a lightning strike had damaged the satellite link. But what I heard through the headphones wasn't static or a corrupted audio file. It was a live, crystal-clear broadcast. The audio feed consisted of a low, rhythmic background hum, the unmistakable sound of a heavy, industrial furnace or a factory engine running in a confined space. And over that hum, a man was speaking. His voice was incredibly deep, slow, and distorted, as if he was using a cheap voice changer app to hide his identity. "Welcome back to Red Room Radio, Broadcast 99, the voice said, sending a sudden cold shiver down my spine. Tonight, we have a very special live stream for our premium dark web subscribers. Tonight, we are tracking a target in real time. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't our broadcast. Someone had violently hijacked our transmitter frequency from an external source. I reached out to flip the master override switch to shut down the transmitter entirely, but the control panel completely ignored my inputs. The monitor's screen locked up, replaced by a single line of red text. Access denied. Let's look at our target for tonight. The distorted deep voice continued through my headphones. He is an engineer. He is sitting alone in an old brick warehouse on Blackwood Road. He is wearing black headphones. He is drinking coffee from a blue mug. I froze solid in my seat. The coffee mug in my left hand was exactly that. A cracked blue ceramic mug. Panic exploded in my chest. I ripped the headphones off my ears, throwing them onto the mixing board. I stood up, my eyes wide as I scanned the dark glass windows of the control room. The warehouse was completely dark except for my monitors. Someone was looking at me right now. I frantically turned around to look at the main security monitor system mounted on the corner wall. The screen showed 16 different camera feeds from around the building. On camera 7, the feed looking at the long, dark hallway directly outside the control room door. A man was standing. He was wearing a heavy black tactical vest and a dark, military-grade balaclava that completely covered his head, leaving only two cold, unblinking eyes visible. In his left hand, he was holding a high-powered laptop connected to a black router box, the device he was using to hijack my station's signal. And in his right hand, he was holding a heavy, black semi-automatic pistol fitted with a long silencer. He was standing barely 20 feet away from my door. Our target is looking at the security camera now. The man's distorted voice suddenly blasted out of the control room's main studio speakers, echoing through the empty building. He has realized he is trapped. Let's see how fast he can run before the stream ends. The figure on the monitor slowly raised his pistol, aimed it directly at the security camera lens, and fired. The feed instantly cut to black static. I didn't think. I knew the main exit at the front of the warehouse was blocked by the shooter. My only way out was the heavy metal emergency exit door at the back of the transmitter room, located through a narrow maze of server racks. I bolted out of the control room's side door, throwing myself into the pitch-black server room. Just as a heavy thud echoed from the main hallway, he had broken into the control room. A massive police tactical unit raided the radio station 30 minutes later. The masked shooter was gone, but they found his laptop router, setup still plugged into our main transmitter board. The computer was left open, displaying a dark web forum chat room with thousands of active users watching a live, black and white video feed of my empty control room. The final message pinned at the top of the chat read, "Target escaped. Stream disconnected." The police never identified the shooter or the owners of the dark web domain. UKIAM shut down its late-night operations permanently after that night. I never went back to broadcast engineering. I took a daytime desk job in a crowded corporate office because I learned that night that the deep web isn't just something hidden on your computer screen. Sometimes, the monsters behind the screen will track your frequency, locate your coordinates, and turn your own life into a live-streamed execution for profit. I've been working as an overnight freight train conductor for Norfolk Southern for nearly 12 years, mostly operating routes that cut through the rugged, heavily forested mountains of West Virginia and Kentucky. If you've never been on a 3-mile-long cargo train cutting through the Appalachian Range at 2:30 a.m., it is a uniquely isolating experience. The only view out the heavy glass window is the massive steel nose of the diesel locomotive, swallowed by thick mountain fog, and the faint silver shine of the steel tracks winding into the pitch-black wilderness. It was late January, during one of the worst cold snaps the region had seen in a decade. I was operating a heavy train loaded with industrial coal through an old, isolated mountain division. Up ahead lay the Black Mountain Tunnel, a historic, mile-long stone tunnel carved straight through the solid rock of the ridge in the early 1900s. The tunnel was notorious among railroad workers because it had zero internal lighting, no ventilation, and absolutely no emergency maintenance alcoves. Once you entered, you were trapped inside a tight stone tube until the train cleared the other side. As the heavy locomotive rumbled toward the dark arched entrance of the tunnel around 2:45 a.m., I turned on the secondary, high-intensity roof spotlights to cut through the freezing mist. The massive train plunged into the damp, freezing darkness of the mountain, the deafening roar of the diesel engines echoing violently off the narrow stone walls. We were about halfway through the mile-long tunnel when the train's primary headlight suddenly flickered twice and died completely, plunging the tracks ahead into absolute crushing blackness. "What the hell?" my engineer, David, muttered, tapping the dashboard gauges. The generator loop just spiked. The auxiliary lights aren't responding. The only light remaining was the faint red and green glow of our cabin dials. I reached for my radio to call the dispatch operator at the nearest yard, but the speaker emitted nothing but a piercing, high-pitched screech that made me rip the headset off. Suddenly, David slammed his foot onto the independent brake valve. The massive air brakes engaged with a deafening, terrifying screech. the heavy steel wheels locking and grinding against the tracks in a shower of brilliant orange sparks. The sheer momentum carried the multi-ton train forward for another 100 yards before it finally groaned to a violent, shuddering halt inside the pitch-black stone cavern. "David, why did you dump the air? What did you see?" I shouted, grabbing the heavy metal handrail to steady myself. David was staring through the shattered front glass, his face completely pale, his hands trembling violently on the control levers. There was someone standing directly on the tracks, right in the center of the rails, he whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. I saw a silhouette right before the high beams died. I think we hit them. My blood ran cold. Hitting someone inside a tight mountain tunnel, miles away from civilization, was a nightmare scenario. I grabbed a heavy, industrial-grade flashlight from the wall bracket, unlocked the heavy steel side cabin door, and stepped out onto the narrow metal running board outside the locomotive. The air inside the tunnel was suffocatingly cold, smelling heavily of ancient moisture, diesel exhaust, and wet stone. The silence was heavy and absolute. I shone my flashlight down at the gravel ballast between the tracks, slowly walking along the steel flank of the massive train toward the front bumper. When the beam hit the massive steel cowcatcher at the front of the train, I stopped. There was no body, no blood, no torn clothing, no impact marks on the steel plate. "David, there's nothing here." I called back toward the cabin window. "Tracks are completely clear." I turned my flashlight beam straight ahead, letting the white light pierce the dark tunnel toward the far exit. About 50 feet ahead, the light illuminated a figure standing perfectly still between the rails. It was a man wearing an old, dirt-encrusted canvas railroad worker uniform from the 1930s. He had a heavy, rusted iron lantern hanging from his left hand, but the glass was shattered and the flame was dead. But what made me completely freeze in my tracks was his face. He didn't have human skin. His face was a decayed, mummified skull, the dark, leathery flesh stretched tightly over the bone, his empty black eye socket staring directly into my flashlight beam. Slowly, the mummified figure raised its right arm, pointing a long, skeletal finger not at me, but directly up at the roof of the stone tunnel above my head. A sudden, sharp instinct told me to look up. I swung the flashlight beam toward the arched stone ceiling directly above me. The ancient mortar between the massive stone blocks had completely cracked away. A massive 5-ton section of solid mountain rock was shifting, buckling under the immense weight of the mountain above, dripping water and loose gravel directly onto my face. The tunnel roof was about to collapse right on top of our locomotive. "Run!" A voice rasped inside my head, though the mummified figure's jaws hadn't moved. I turned around in pure panic, sprinting back along the metal steps of the train, throwing myself into the cabin and slamming the steel door shut. "David, throw it in reverse. Right now. Back out of the tunnel," I screamed. David didn't ask questions. He jammed the reverser handle back and slammed the throttle open. The massive diesel engines roared to life, the tires screaming as the 80,000-ton train began backing out of the dark mountain tube at maximum power. We had barely cleared the tunnel's arched entrance when a deafening, ground-shaking roar exploded from inside the mountain. Boom! A massive cloud of white dust, rocks, and ancient timber blasted out of the tunnel mouth like a cannon. The entire mid-section of the Black Mountain Tunnel had completely collapsed, burying the tracks under hundreds of tons of solid rock. If we had stayed inside for even 30 more seconds, our locomotive would have been crushed flat. When the railroad company investigated the collapse the next week, they discovered that the stone section that collapsed was directly adjacent to an old, Forgotten Mass, grave of Chinese railroad laborers who had died during a dynamite accident in 1904. The mummified figure David, and I saw hadn't been trying to derail our train. It had been warning us of the impending collapse. I never took another route through that mountain division. Some spirits stay trapped inside the dark stone tubes of the Appalachians, and I am not going back to find out what happens when the warning lights go out for good. I've been working as an independent hotshot driver and courier for nearly 7 years, driving a heavy-duty pickup truck with a 40-foot flatbed trailer, delivering specialized industrial parts to remote drilling sites across western Texas and New Mexico. When you're an independent driver, you don't use the massive, crowded travel plazas like Pilot or Love's. You mostly use the small, isolated state-run rest stops, the ones that are just a concrete restroom building, a couple of picnic tables, and a dark asphalt parking lot surrounded by miles of empty desert sagebrush and total darkness. It was a freezing, windy Wednesday night on Route 285, right around 3:15 a.m. I had been driving for 9 hours straight, my eyes burning from the constant glare of the high beams on the cracked pavement. I saw a small blue sign indicating a rest area a mile ahead, and I let out a deep breath of relief. I pulled my rig off the empty highway, rolling onto the dark concrete lot. The place was completely deserted. No other trucks, no cars, just the heavy desert wind rattling the metal chains on the flagpole. I parked the truck under a broken, buzzing street lamp, leaving my amber running lights on. I stepped out of the warm cab into the biting cold wind, my boots crunching loudly on the dry gravel as I walked toward the concrete restroom building to splash cold water on my face. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering fluorescent tube. The air smelled heavily of bleach and damp concrete. As I stood at the rusted metal sink, washing my face, the main entrance door slowly creaked open behind me. I didn't turn around immediately, assuming it was just another tired traveler who had pulled in. But then, a strange sound made me freeze. It wasn't the sound of heavy boots on concrete. It was a rhythmic, wet, dragging sound, followed by the heavy clicking of long, sharp nails against the tile floor. Slide, click, slide, click. I slowly raised my eyes to look into the cracked mirror above the sink. Standing in the doorway behind me was a figure that made my stomach drop into a cold pit of terror. It didn't look human. It was incredibly tall, easily 6'5", but its body was emaciated to the point of deformity. Its skin a sickly, pale, leathery texture that was stretched so tightly over its ribcage, I could see the bone structure. Its arms were unnaturally long, its fingers ending in thick, curved black talons that were scratching slowly against the concrete wall. But its face was the most horrific part. It had no hair, no ears, and its eyes were completely hidden behind a thick layer of dirty white. Medical bandages wrapped tightly around its head. A massive, jagged jaw filled with rows of needle-sharp yellow teeth was exposed, dripping thick saliva onto the floor. The creature's jaw slowly unhinged, letting out a low, vibrating click that sounded exactly like a swarm of cicadas. Chirp, click, click. Primal survival instinct took over my mind. I didn't scream. I lunged to my right, throwing my entire weight against the wooden door of the disabled toilet stall, slamming it shut and locking the small metal slide bolt just as a heavy, wet weight slammed into the outside of the door. Bang! The wooden panel cracked down the center. Through the splintered gap, I could see those long, pale fingers with black claws reaching inside, feeling blindly for the lock. the wet clicking sound growing louder and faster. "Help!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, though I knew nobody was within miles. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my heavy steel tire pressure gauge. The only weapon I had, as the creature's long arm slipped through the broken wooden slot, trying to reach the deadbolt, I raised the heavy steel bar and smashed it down onto its pale wrist with all my strength. Crack! The creature let out a high-pitched, metallic howl that sounded like a wounded animal mixed with a screeching train brake. It violently ripped its arm back out of the stall. I heard it skittering across the tile floor, moving with terrifying speed before the main entrance door slammed open. I waited inside that locked stall for 10 agonizing minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to the wind howling outside. Finally, I unlocked the stall, stepped over the pool of dark, foul-smelling green fluid the creature had left on the floor, and bolted out the front door toward my pickup truck. As I scrambled into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I looked out my passenger window toward the dark desert fields beyond the asphalt lot. Under the dim orange glow of my truck's running lights, I could see the tall, bandaged creature crouching on top of a low concrete picnic shelter 20 yards away. Its head was tilted at a sharp, unnatural angle. Its blind, bandaged face pointed directly at my cabin. It slowly raised its injured arm, its long black claws clicking together in the dark, as if it was promising to finish what it started. I jammed the truck into gear and stomped on the gas pedal, the heavy trailer tires screaming as I blasted out of the rest stop and back onto the main highway. I didn't stop until I reached a massive, well-lit truck stop 60 miles away in New Mexico. I told the local sheriff what happened, but they found nothing at the rest stop except the broken stall door and the green fluid dried onto the concrete floor. I never stop at state rest areas after midnight anymore. Some stretches of the West Texas Highway belong to things that hunt the lonely roads, and I am not going back to find out what's underneath those bandages. I've been working as an independent gig economy delivery driver and courier in Chicago for nearly 4 years, mostly taking late-night shifts for specialized, high-paying delivery apps that transport legal documents, high-end electronics, and private medical cargo across the city between 1:06 a.m. and 5:00 a.m. The pay is incredible during those hours, mostly because nobody else wants to drive into the dark, abandoned industrial districts of the South Side after midnight. It was a rainy, freezing Friday in December, right around 2:45 a.m. I was sitting in my car, keeping the heater running, when a notification popped up on my phone from a private, invite-only courier app I had signed up for a month prior. The payout was staggering, $500 for a single 20-minute delivery. The instructions were simple: pick up a sealed silver briefcase from an automated locker inside a 24-hour laundromat and deliver it to an abandoned warehouse at the end of a pier near the industrial canal. The high payout should have been a massive red flag, but I was short on rent money and couldn't afford to turn it down. I drove to the laundromat, retrieved the heavy, metallic briefcase using a digital QR code, and placed it securely on my passenger seat. The briefcase was completely smooth, with no labels, no logos, and a heavy digital lock system that hummed faintly with electricity. As I drove toward the industrial canal, the rain turned into a blinding downpour, the heavy drops blurring my windshield despite my wipers moving at maximum speed. The GPS routed me down an old, unlit gravel road lined with rusted chain-link fences and towering stacks of scrap metal. At the very end of the road stood the destination, an old, abandoned shipping warehouse from the 1940s, its glass windows long broken, its corrugated iron walls covered in rust. I parked my car near the collapsed loading dock, leaving the engine running. The delivery instructions on my phone updated with a final text line. Bring the package inside the basement locker. Leave the door open. I let out a heavy sigh, grabbing my heavy flashlight and the silver briefcase. I stepped out into the freezing rain, my sneakers splashing through the deep muddy puddles as I walked through a broken side door into the dark warehouse. Inside, the air was suffocatingly cold, smelling heavily of damp oil, mold, and old iron. I shone my flashlight beam down a narrow, concrete staircase leading into the dark basement level. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight beam illuminated a small, clean metal desk sitting in the middle of a massive, empty concrete room. On the desk sat a high-powered laptop computer, its screen glowing with a bright white interface, displaying a live chat room on a hidden deep web network. I walked over to the desk, intending to leave the briefcase and get out as fast as possible. But as I set the silver case down, my eyes caught the text scrolling across the laptop screen. The chat room header read, "Live execution stream. Target 44." And the messages scrolling across the screen made my blood run cold. "The courier has entered the basement," a user named Red Mamba wrote. "Look at his face. He has no idea what's inside the case." Another user named Ghost77 typed, "Open the case remotely now. Let him see the timer." A third user posted. Suddenly, a loud, metallic click echoed from the silver briefcase on the desk. The digital lock system deactivated, the heavy lid slowly swinging open on its hinges. I shone my flashlight inside. The briefcase didn't contain documents or electronics. It contained a military-grade, high-explosive device wired to a digital countdown clock. The red numbers on the screen were actively ticking down. 1000 at 0130, 0001 29, 0301 28. I had less than 90 seconds before the entire basement was blown to pieces. This wasn't a standard delivery. I had been lured into a trap to be the victim of a live-streamed assassination for a dark web gambling ring. Panic exploded in my chest. I dropped my flashlight, turned around, and bolted toward the concrete staircase at maximum speed. But as my foot touched the bottom step, a heavy steel security door slammed down from the ceiling above, blocking the exit with a deafening metallic crash. Clang! I was trapped inside the concrete bunker, with a live bomb ticking down. Look at him run. 80% of the viewers bet he wouldn't make it to the door. The text on the laptop screen scrolled at a manic speed, the users cheering as they watched me through a hidden pinhole camera hidden in the brick wall. The timer was at 45 seconds. Chandra, Chisigo, 45, 0044. I didn't have time to try to defuse the bomb. I turned around, scanning the dark room for any other exit. Near the back wall, an old, rusted iron ventilation shaft sat about 4 feet off the ground, its metal grill loose and rattling from the storm outside. I ran to the wall, jammed my fingers into the gaps of the rusted grill, and yanked it off with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I threw my body headfirst into the narrow, dark metal tube, crawling frantically on my stomach through the dust and old cobwebs, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Behind me, the digital clock hit 0. A deafening, ground-shaking explosion rocked the warehouse. A massive wall of fire and extreme pressure blasted into the basement, the shockwave ripping through the metal ventilation shaft like a hurricane. The sheer force propelled me forward, throwing me violently out the end of the tube into the freezing, muddy canal outside. I hit the freezing water hard, gasping for air as the entire brick warehouse above collapsed into a burning mountain of rubble and twisted steel. I managed to crawl out of the canal, shivering uncontrollably, and ran down the gravel road until a passing police car found me. The federal authorities investigated the site, but the server routing data on the laptop had been completely wiped by the explosion. The developers of the delivery app vanished from the web within minutes. I deleted every single gig economy and delivery app from my phone that very night. I took a low-paying job at a local grocery store during the day because I learned that night that on the deep web, you aren't the courier, you are the content. And some clients will pay millions just to watch your clock tick down to zero in the dark. I've been driving long-haul overnight routes for a major freight corporation for nearly 9 years, mostly taking the northern route across Interstate 90 through the dense forests and desolate plains of Montana and Washington State. If you've ever driven that stretch of highway between 2 St. a.m. and 5 a.m., you know it is an incredibly lonely place. For 50 miles at a time, there are 0 exit ramps, 0 gas stations, and absolutely no artificial lighting. It's just your high beams cutting through the dark walls of towering pine trees lining both sides of the asphalt. It was mid-December, during a brutal winter storm that had coated the road in a thick layer of black ice. I was driving an 18-wheeler loaded with heavy paper goods, keeping my speed down to 50 miles per hour to avoid jackknifing the massive trailer. The snow was falling in heavy, fat flakes that swirled frantically in front of my windshield, creating a hypnotic blinding tunnel of white light. Around 3:30 a.m., my dashboard oil pressure gauge suddenly dropped into the red zone, accompanied by a loud, metallic knocking sound coming from underneath the massive hood. Clank. Clank, clank. I let out a heavy curse, knowing I couldn't keep driving without completely blowing the engine. I carefully steered the massive truck onto the wide snow-covered shoulder of the interstate, pulling the emergency brake valve. The cabin filled with the familiar loud hiss of air brakes, and the truck went silent except for the heavy wind howling through the pine trees. I reached for my company-issued radio to call for a heavy tow truck, but the screen stayed completely blank. The freezing cold had completely drained the auxiliary battery unit. I was entirely alone, trapped on the side of a frozen highway in the middle of a Montana wilderness. I decided to step outside and check the oil lines myself, assuming it was just a loose sensor cap. I pulled on my heavy winter coat, grabbed a heavy iron wrench and a powerful flashlight, and stepped out onto the metal running board into the freezing storm. The cold was instantaneous, biting into my face like needles. I walked to the front of the truck, unlatched the massive fiberglass hood, and lifted it open, using the flashlight beam to inspect the smoking diesel engine block. As I was tightening a loose valve fluid line, a strange sound made me stop. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the cracking of frozen branches. It was a deep, wet, heavy breathing sound coming from the dark woods directly outside the highway fence, barely 20 feet away from my front bumper. I raised my flashlight, shining the powerful white beam past the metal guardrail into the dense tree line. The light cut through the falling snow, illuminating the thick trunks of the pine trees. What I saw made my blood run instantly cold. Standing on its hind legs, behind a thick pine tree, was a creature that looked structurally impossible. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in a thick coat of tattered, matted black fur that was caked with dried blood and frozen ice. Its torso was wide and muscular, but its arms were unnaturally long, ending in thick, heavy paws with 4-inch long curved black claws. But its head was the most terrifying part. It had the skull of a massive gray wolf, but the jaw was unhinged, revealing rows of jagged broken teeth, and its eyes weren't animal eyes. They were two glowing, intelligent yellow slits that locked directly onto my face with absolute, malicious intent. The creature raised its massive head toward the sky, but it didn't let out a wolf's howl. It let out a sound that sounded like a human child screaming in agonizing pain, distorted through a deep, animalistic filter. "Help me! Please help me!" the beast shrieked, using perfect English words in that horrific dual-toned voice. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over me. This thing wasn't an animal. It was a predator that mimicked human voices to lure its prey into the dark woods. I didn't say a word. I dropped my wrench into the snow, turned around, and scrambled back toward the driver's side door of my truck as fast as my heavy winter boots could move. Behind me, I heard the terrifying sound of the metal chain link perimeter fence being violently ripped out of the frozen ground. The creature was charging. I threw myself into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and slammed the lock button down just as a massive, fur-covered paw slammed into the outside of my window. Bang! The thick safety glass shattered into thousands of tiny shards, but the heavy, steel reinforcement bar inside the doorframe held, preventing the beast from completely breaking into the cabin. Through the broken glass, those glowing yellow eyes stared at me from 6 inches away, the overwhelming stench of rotting meat and wet fur filling the cabin. The creature raised its other paw, its long black talons tearing through the heavy metal sheeting of my door like it was thin cardboard, trying to reach inside to unlock the latch. I frantically turned the ignition key, praying to whatever god was listening that the frozen engine would turn over. The truck groaned, the starter motor clicking weakly. "Chug, chug, chug. Come outside, driver. It's cold out here." The beast rasped through the broken window, its voice morphing into a perfect imitation of my own dispatcher's voice from the office. I let out a terrified scream, slamming my fist onto the dashboard while turning the key one more time. The massive diesel engine violently roared to life, the exhaust pipe blasting a thick cloud of black smoke into the air. Without setting the airlines properly, I jammed the transmission into low gear and stomped on the gas pedal. The heavy 18-wheeler surged forward, the massive tires spinning and catching traction on the icy asphalt as I blasted away from the shoulder back onto the main highway. Through my side mirror, I watched the beast run alongside my truck for nearly 50 yards at 60 miles per hour, its massive legs moving with terrifying, effortless speed through the deep snowbanks, before it finally let out one last human scream and vanished into the dark mountain forest. I drove for 40 miles straight without stopping, ignoring the warning lights flashing on my dashboard, until I finally reached a massive state highway patrol station. The troopers searched my truck and found deep, 3-inch long gouges carved straight into the thick steel of my driver's side, cabin door, and multiple strands of thick, coarse black fur caught in the shattered glass window frame. They told me that multiple hikers and stranded motorists had vanished without a trace along that specific stretch of I-90 over the past year. I quit my long-haul trucking job that very week. I took a local delivery route in the city where there are plenty of streetlights and people, because I know that out in the deep forests of Montana, there are things that listen to our voices, learn our names, and wait for the winter storms to call us out into the dark.